I'm Joshua Bardwell, and I know you're going to learn something today because I'm going to tell you the results of battery testing that I've done that no one has ever seen before. I've got Thunderpower Adrenaline. Do they live up to the hype? I always ask that question about battery tests. Do they live up to the hype? Well, there's a lot of hype around batteries, and sometimes the batteries live up, sometimes they don't. We'll find out if Thunderpower Adrenaline lives up to the hype. I've also got a few new formulations from Dinogy. Dinogy hasn't done a great job in my past testing. Let's see if the new ones do any better. And I've got a couple other brands that you've probably never heard of. I hadn't heard of them, and one of them did really well. Teaser! For those of you who are new to my battery testing, I'm going to take just a couple brief minutes. I know I do tend to go on. I'm going to keep it brief and just give you a quick overview of what my test procedure is and give you some insight into how to interpret the results. I test the batteries by discharging them at 60 amps. It's not a current controlled source, so it starts off at about 62 amps, and then as the voltage drops, it drops sometimes even as low as maybe 55 amps. But it's a controlled load for every single battery, and it's nominally around 60 amps. And I discharge the batteries until they hit 14 volts. That's my cutoff. When they hit 14 volts, I stop the discharge. At that point, the battery recovers because it's going to sag under load, so it recovers up to some value. And once it recovers, I hit it again. And I keep hitting it until it's resting at around 15 volts. Now, the reason I do this is because I think that 60 amps is a respectable discharge rate. When I very first started doing this testing, I did 20 amps, and then I did 40 amps, and then I did 60 amps, and the battery performance got worse and worse. And when I got to 60 amps, I quickly realized that there was very little point in going any further. Many batteries just fell flat on their face at 60 amps. Some batteries did an okay job at 60 amps, but by 60 amps, you could really tell who were the good batteries and who were the batteries that were maybe not quite as good. And if you look at what we're doing with our quadcopters, many of us are flying with, we're typically in the 20 or 30 amps range, maybe with slight peaks up to 50 or 60 amps. Very few of us are doing a sustained 60 amp discharge. So if a battery does well in this testing, I feel confident that the battery will do well on your quadcopter. I chose 14 volts as the cutoff because I feel like that's a safe place to stop discharging your battery and still get a decent service life out of it. Some of you may feel comfortable letting your battery sag down to 13.6 volts maybe. And if you're pulling 100 or 120 amps, if you have a really, really high discharge copter, you may have no choice but to let your battery sag that low. That's okay. I chose 14 volts as my cutoff, and that's where I'm at, and I'm testing all the batteries the same way. I feel pretty confident that a battery that does really well at 14 volts cutoff, it'll still do really well. It'll do even better at 13.6 volts. And a battery that does poorly at 14 volts probably won't do much better at 13.6. So you can move that around anywhere you want. 14 volts is just where I cut it off. Having said all that, let's take a look at the results, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how to interpret the results as we look at the actual results from these batteries. The first batteries we're going to look at are these Reev Electrics. These are Reev Electrics graphene batteries. The Reev Electrics sells them under the label of GoPack. The G in GoPack means graphene, I guess. I don't know. These are the blend 420 graphene, so they're standard LiPo batteries. The blend 435 are high volts. They're designed to be charged to 4.35 volts per cell. I am done with high volts, and I'm not going to tell you about that now. I've got a video about why I'm done with high volts, and I will put a link in the upper right-hand corner of the video. You can go watch that if you like. Reevo's high volt batteries that I tested before didn't do great. Well, no, that's not true. They did great in my testing, but then 5 or 10 or maybe 20 cycles at most later, they were puffed and useless. So they had a really, really short cycle life, and they only really performed well for the first few cycles. And this is not just based on my testing, but based on field reports from, let's just say, many, many people. So that was a big part of my decision to abandon high volts. And let's see if the Reev Electrics graphenes, the standard 420 blends, did any better. As we look at the first round of testing, let me tell you how to interpret the results. The first thing I want to show you is what I think is probably the most significant result out of all of them, and that is the longest burst. Now that is the longest amount of time that the battery was able to sustain the 60 amp discharge without sagging below 14 volts. In other words, if you were to peg the throttle and pull 60 amps and keep going until the battery hit 14 volts, this is how long you would be able to peg the throttle. And it is a direct measure of the battery's ability to resist sag. A burst of less than 5 seconds is okay. A burst of 1 or 2 seconds is not that great. A burst of between 5 and 10 seconds is pretty good, and a burst of more than 10 seconds is spectacular. I think that once you get over about 10 seconds, the differences don't really matter. In other words, one battery may have a 30 or 35 second burst, another battery may have a 40 or 45 second burst, and I don't think that second battery is necessarily that much better than the first one. They're both really, really good, but one is maybe not better than the other. And the reason for that is that the exact point where the battery falls below 14 volts depends on where exactly the plateau and the drop-off point in the discharge curve is. And so I don't think you should read too much into it once a discharge is above about 10 seconds. This battery, the 1550, pulled a 20-second burst. That's really, really excellent. And the 1300 pulled a 5-second burst. That's okay, but not spectacular. If we look at the number of bursts, that is how many individual times I had to close the switch and open the switch to get the battery down to 15 volts resting. And here, lower is better. We would rather have a battery that dumps all of its current in one big burst without ever sagging below 14 volts. If we have a lot of bursts, then that means we're constantly having to hit the throttle, back off the throttle, hit the throttle, back off the throttle as the battery sags, and that's not a way that we want to be flying. Both of these batteries had 15 and then 20 bursts. These are middling numbers. It's not spectacular, it's not great. And I think if we look at the longest burst, that tells us more about the battery's performance, I think, than the number of bursts. The time here is the total amount of time that it took for the battery to discharge down to the resting of 15 volts. Here, longer is better. It means the battery was able to discharge more current for longer without dropping below 14 volts. The 1500 did 64 seconds. This is a pretty good time for a 1500. The 1300 did 45 seconds. It's okay, but not spectacular for a 1300. The milliamp hours shows the total milliamp hours that the battery discharged. Now, it's very, very common. You may look at this and go, wait a minute, this is a 1300 and a 1500, but they only discharge 700 and 900 milliamp hours. That's nowhere near their rated capacity. The higher your discharge rate, the more energy you will waste as heat and the more sag you will get, and therefore the less milliamp hours you will get. So it's very normal to see at these extreme discharge rates, the milliamp hours is nowhere close to the rated number. A discharge of between, say, 65 and 70% of the rated capacity is very, very good at a 60 amp discharge rate. That's based on my previous rounds of testing, just what I've seen batteries do. A discharge of less than about 60% is not great. And so we see here that the 63% discharge milliamp hour for the 1550 that's respectable. The 55% for the 1300 it's okay, but it's not great. Watt hours here shows the total power that the battery put out. Now, we could say that we're always thinking about amps and milliamp hours, but I like to say that amps make heat, but watts do work. Watts is volts times amps. And the more, that's what really equates to your motor spinning faster and with more power. So a battery with more watt hours is really going to do more work. It's going to have more ability to make the copter go than a battery with fewer watt hours. Here we see that the 1550 had 13.9 watt hours and the 1300 has 10.0 watt hours. Now, in order to really interpret those numbers, we need to compare them to other batteries of similar size. And you can do that here, looking at these numbers that I've got on screen. And you can also download this spreadsheet. I've got a link to this spreadsheet in the video description. And you can use these filter. For example, you can filter here based on 1300 milliamp hour batteries. And you can find all the 1300 milliamp hour batteries and sort. You could sort it based on the watt hours that they contain and see which ones do the best. So that's an exercise I'll leave to you. The 10 watt hours for the 1300 is, again, okay, but not spectacular. The 15 watt hours, or 14 watt hours rather, for the 1550 is pretty good. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the temperature. That's the temperature of the battery measured at the end of the test. Now, this is a little bit imperfect. It's taken from the surface of the battery, whereas the inside of the cell is probably hotter. And there's other factors that mean this number it's not the absolute perfect way of measuring this, but it's the best we've got. The best I've got. And I like to say that a stopping temperature of between 115 and 120 degrees is okay. Less than 115 is great. Between 120 and 125 is on the edge, but still tolerable for a high performance battery. And over 125 degrees, I think, is going to severely affect the battery's overall service life. Now, this is just a bench test. In the air with airflow going over the battery would be a little bit cooler, but I feel like that I've calibrated these numbers for that. They're all being tested on the bench, so they're all being tested under equal conditions. And we can see that the 1550 did a fantastic job here at 110 degrees, the 1300 at 116 degrees. It's a little warm, but it's acceptable. So I feel like between these two, the 1550 actually had a really good showing. In every one of the metrics, it did a pretty good, if not in some cases, spectacular job. And at the end of it, it even had a reasonably cool temperature, which suggests, in as much as we can draw inferences from this very limited amount of data, it suggests that it may have a longer service life. The 1300 I'm not super impressed with, and especially at a price of $40, I think there's better options. Frankly, with the 1550, at a price of $40, I think there's probably better options. But if you love Reev Electrics, the 1550 is an okay choice. I do need to talk for a second about the pricing on the Reev Electrics. I looked at the price, and if you go to the Reev Electrics store, you'll see that the price of these batteries is about $25. But that's from the Singapore store, and you have to pay shipping. And by the time you ship it somewhere, the price roughly doubles. Because of shipping regulations and so on. So I went to the USA store and I took the prices for these from the USA store instead, and you see that a battery that's $25 from the Singapore store is $40 from the USA store. I feel like the $40 price is more reflective of what a typical person would actually pay, but if you live in Singapore and you can buy one of these batteries for 25 bucks, it suddenly becomes a much better option. Next, we'll look at the Mad Dog. This is a Mad Dog 1300 Graphene. Now, Mad Dog is Two Dog RC's house brand. If you don't know Two Dog RC, go ahead and check them out. They're a retailer of quadcopter-related stuff, and they have a house brand of batteries. They used to sell all high-volt batteries, and I worked with them to test their batteries, and I work with them on and off, and I told them, I can't recommend high volts anymore. I don't think you should sell high volts. I don't think anybody should sell them because I feel like the people are not getting their money's worth because they die so quickly. And I don't know if I was the one who caused this decision or if I just happened to be the right person, in the right place at the right time. But the guy who runs Two Dog RC said, no, I agree. We're moving away from high volts. We're not going to sell high volts anymore. And then we've got this new line of graphene batteries. And so I tested them. And I tested the 1300 graphene. Let's see how it did. Here we can see that the longest burst for the 1300 graphene is 10 seconds. This is starting to get into the range of very good, but not into the range of spectacular, which I would say is a more than 10-second burst. So this is very good, but not spectacular. We have 10 bursts. The low number of bursts means that the battery was able to hold its voltage up, and even though each individual burst was not longer than about 10 seconds, we can see that it discharged its full capacity in a relatively small number of bursts. So this is starting to look like a fairly good performer. The total time to discharge was 58 seconds. We see that something around 60 seconds for a 1300, that's pretty good. 890 milliamp hours or 68% of its rated capacity. That's very good. I said that between 65 and 70% was quite good at a 60 amp discharge rate. 12.7 watt hours, that's respectable. Much better, you can see, than the Reev Electrics under the exact same test conditions. And the temperature at the end was 113 degrees. Again, that's a perfectly good number. In fact, that's really quite good since it was less than 115 degrees. So at a price of $35, this is a pretty good battery. What about the Adrenalines? Oh man, I was so excited to get to test these. And I've tested other batteries in the past. One that names with LiPo. Oh, no, Bapu is actually a guy. I shouldn't use that. Well, anyway, I think you know who I'm referring to. I tested some of their batteries that racers rave about, and in my testing, they didn't do a spectacular job, and I don't know what to make of that. All I can say is, here's what I did, and here was the result. Maybe my testing isn't, perfect. Maybe there's things that happen in the field when you're actually racing that aren't reflected in my testing. Okay, I acknowledge that. But I tested them and they didn't do great, and I felt a little bit bad about that because if there's batteries that people are raving about, I love to say, yes, you're right, they're fantastic. Well, this is a case where these batteries definitely lived up to their hype. If we take a look, we can see that the longest burst was 26 seconds for the 1300 or 43 seconds for the 1600. 43-second burst is amazing. 60 amps for 43 seconds. Think about that for a minute. That's astounding. I mean, if your battery if you get a 2-minute and 30-second flight time, that's a really significant chunk of your whole flight time that you could just discharge in one big long burst. The 1600 had a total of 5 bursts. The 1300 had a total of 7 bursts. Again, remember, lower is better here. We want the battery to dump its whole discharge in as close to 1 burst as possible. And the total time was 55 seconds for the 1300, 69 seconds for the 1600. Fine. We saw here 67% and 64% of their rated capacity in milliamp hours. Of course, you're going to see much more than that if you're not doing 60 amps just flat out. Again, these are very respectable numbers. 11.9 watt hours, so slightly less for the Thunderpower than for the Mad Dog, and 15.3 watt hours for the 1600. These are pretty good numbers. And as far as temperature goes, they were running a little hot. Both of them exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, but they did not exceed 125 degrees Fahrenheit, which for me is if it goes over 125, I feel really hesitant to recommend the battery. So I would say that these are high-performing batteries. These are very high-performing batteries. They're quite good in terms of their ability to deliver amps without sagging. They run a little bit hot on the bench. They're probably fine in the field. They might not have the same service life of a cooler running battery, but they're certainly going to deliver a lot of performance. As far as the price goes, they come in at 35 or 40 bucks, and that is a typical price for a premium battery. I feel like these batteries, if you're going to pay for a premium battery, you want premium performance, and with these batteries, you definitely are getting it. How about these Dynogys? Now, again, I want to remind you that these first two, these 80C batteries, these are the orange label Dynogys, and this 70C battery is the old silver label or gray label Dynogy. The 1300 had a longest burst of 8 seconds. Now that's completely respectable, but at a price of $35, we can find other batteries that do better. There's nothing bad about this, but there's better ones out there. The 1500 did extraordinarily well. A 59-second longest burst and a total of 3 bursts. So the 1500 is really, it did much better than the 1300. And I kind of find myself wondering if that has something to do with the 1500 was able to hold at like 14.1 volts and stay over the threshold. Maybe if I had lowered the threshold to like 13.8 volts, the 1300 would have held on. But the threshold is where it is, and these are the results we got. The 1500 also delivered 72% of its rated capacity and 15.4 watt hours of power. And if we compare that, well, let's compare that to the silver label. We see 12.7 watt hours. And if we look at the Reev Electrics 1550, we see 13.9 watt hours. And if we look at the Thunderpower Adrenaline 1600, that's 100 milliamp hours more, we see it delivered 15.3 watt hours. So this 1550 Dinogy Graphene delivered more power than a 1600 Thunderpower. It really, actually, I think you have to say that the Dinogy 1500 Graphene beat the Thunderpower Adrenaline 1600 in, let's see, every metric. Let's see, 59-second longest burst versus 43 seconds, that's better. 3 bursts versus 5 bursts, that's better. Watt hours, better. By 6 milliamp hours, it even delivered more milliamp hours than a freaking 1600. It did better. So this guy is actually, I think, the star of the show, and it finished with a temperature of 120 degrees, which is well within the range of what's safe. I think this Dinogy 1500 Graphene is the star of the show. Last one is this Dinogy 1500. This is the 70C, silver label, gray label, whatever. It did terribly. It did terribly. It did terribly. The longest burst was 5 seconds. And it was 15 bursts and just not great. Nothing to say about it. So this Dinogy here and this Reev Electrics here, I think, these are the two dogs of this round of testing. They just didn't do great. Oh, hang on. We're not done yet. I just realized, I was going to hang on a second. I think there was one. Oh, yeah, there was one more battery. TruePower batteries. Yeah, I'm a terrible reviewer. I left them off the spreadsheet for the whole rest of the video. But don't worry, I didn't forget them entirely. Let's take a look at how they did. TruePower sent me a 1350 and a 1600, and they did really well in the testing. This is the one that I mentioned in the intro when I said a rock star that you hadn't heard of before. I hadn't heard of them before either. I think they may be relatively new to the scene. There is actually a company, TruePower Batteries, TruePower or something. They don't make LiPos, they make like car batteries and stuff, and maybe TruePower should have done a little more due diligence before they named their company. I don't know. I don't know about that, but the batteries did really well. The 1350 had a 22-second longest burst, very, very respectable number, really an extraordinary number. And the 1600 had a 60-second burst. Oh my gosh, it outperformed even the Dinogy 1500, which was the rock star of this test round. Let's see how else they did. 2 bursts for the TruePower 1600. In other words, it basically dumped its whole capacity in one burst with one little 8-second burst to follow. Really, really good. That compares to the Dinogy 1500, which did 3 bursts. So again, very, very similar performance. The milliamp hours for the TruePower 1600, 1036 milliamp hours to 1077 for the Dinogy. Very close, but the Dinogy did edge it out. The Dinogy, however, is rated as a 1500. Maybe the Dinogy's underrated. Maybe it's actually a 1600. It certainly is putting up 1600 numbers in terms of all this stuff. In terms of the watt hours, 14.8 watt hours for the TruePower 1600, 15.4 watt hours for the Dinogy. So the Dinogy beat it. This, again, the Dinogy 1500 is certainly acting like a 1600. Really make you wish I put the weight on the spreadsheet. I'll talk more about that later. And finally, as far as temperature goes, 120 degrees for the 1600, 114 degrees for the 1350. Absolutely nothing concerning about those. Those are wonderful numbers, and the batteries are performing. That suggests that they'll have reasonable longevity. Well, there you go. That is going to bring us to the end of this round of testing, and hopefully you've got some information that will help you decide what batteries you want to buy in the future. If you want to go ahead and look at the spreadsheet, you can see all the test results from all of the batteries I've tested. Some of it's a little bit old, and you probably shouldn't pay too much attention to it, but you can go dig through it, and you can have all the spreadsheet fun that your little nerd heart desires. You may have noticed also that I didn't do 20 amp testing in this round. Yeah, about that. I think the 60 amp testing is really the best way to tell which batteries are doing best, and I kind of feel like the 20 amp testing is not as interesting. I was a little short on time this time, so I said, oh, screw it, I'll just do the 60 amp testing and skip the 20 amp testing. You may have also noticed that I didn't put the batteries' weights in, and that's because I forgot to weigh them. And by the time I got to the point of where I'm at now, I don't actually own all of these batteries anymore. I don't keep, I guess, too many batteries for one guy to use. I move them out into the local community, try and help everybody out, and get feedback also from other people. So anyway, I apologize for that. Yeah, I nothing I can say, but maybe I'll do better next time. And I hope I've still given you useful information. I try to focus on the high points and what really matters. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. Let me know what you think of these results. And as always, happy flying.